Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. Today's episode marks a kind of critical juncture in this series, I think, because today we'll be getting to the linchpin, in my opinion, of the Platonic teaching on love and desire, or eros. That crucial final step or element in this teaching that, at least in theory, opens up a solution to the great problem of being human that I introduced near the very beginning of this series, and that has cropped up so much as a theme of it. And that problem, of course, is self-dividedness, or perhaps better, existential alienation, because I'm talking about a sense of being divided or cut off from not just oneself, but the world, being cut off from nature, both one's own nature, internal nature, you could say, and external nature, the cosmos, something we may or may not be aware of at different points in our lives, but that seems to manifest itself in the form of compulsions and addictions of various kinds. Later in this series, I'll be talking about how I think we action this theoretical solution that I'll be talking about today. Although, as I'll also be explaining, I think one of the wonderful things about this teaching is that the psychic healing or growth that it enables starts, I think, already, even in our very glimpsing of the theoretical solution. So first, to quickly recap our exploration of Platonic love to this point, we saw in Plato's dialogue The Symposium, the prophetess Diotima somewhat startlingly claimed that all human desire is for nothing other than the good, and we may have wondered what she was talking about. For example, did she mean the good in a moral sense, or perhaps the good in the sense of the pleasant, in the sense that we say something tastes good or feels good? In other words, you could say whether she meant the objective or subjective good. And we saw that, in fact, what Plato means by the good is something that transcends the entire distinction we know in the everyday of subject and object. It's, in fact, the principle of both thinking and being. And so, in my opinion, for Plato, and in any case, certainly for the later Platonic tradition, the so-called Neoplatonic tradition, the good must transcend these distinctions, since it is also absolute unity, the unity of being, or being in its absolute unity, that transcends all distinction, including our everyday distinction of subject and object that we use when we are abstracting, when we are, in a way, modeling the world, recreating it in our heads, either for the pure pleasure of it or in order to control it. I don't think I've mentioned this explicitly in this series so far, but you guys may have basically inferred it. What we have here in this conception of the good is something really quite remarkable, because it seems to hold a striking potential for reconciling these two types of cognition, or two elements of psychic life that I've spoken about a lot in this series, which I like to call mediated and immediate cognition, or if you like, reason and feeling, that at times can seem like two parts of the self, each with its own agenda, its own desire, its own ultimate object. Those two things I mentioned earlier, on the one hand, the moral good or truth, the true good, the objective or reasoned or mediated good, and on the other hand, pleasure, the apparent or subjective or immediate good. Because the good in this Platonic conception isn't just the principle of truth, because it is also the one, it is also the principle of unity or immediacy. And so, insofar as we attain it immediately. And so if this is truly the object of our desire, we can see how it could be the key to resolving this universal problem of human nature, because in its attainment would be satisfied both these psychic elements, the part in us that desires truth and the part that desires immediacy. But this idea in turn seemed to leave us with a massive problem, because this attainment of the one and good, this transcendence of everyday consciousness and of everyday selfishness, this mystical experience that Plato seems to be talking about, just doesn't seem to be what we see people, including ourselves, spending their time longing for. And this made Diotima's bold assertion seem kind of out of touch with reality. And this, I think, is why this dialogue, the Phaedrus, is so absolutely critical to Platonic love. In a single step, which basically dawns on us as we listen to Socrates tell his myth of the psyche, Plato explains how all human desire can be for the good. And that is through the concept of erotic forgetting and recollecting, or to put it in more modern language, the notion of a desire that is unconscious but can be raised to consciousness. The making of a distinction between conscious and unconscious desire. That's what makes all the difference. We come into the world with a desire for the good itself, the transcendent, absolute good, but that desire is unconscious. In other words, we have a kind of knowledge that the good is the object of our desire, but this knowledge is potential rather than actual. It's kind of like a predisposition. It must be actualized by these triggers of what I've called the anti-trauma, these good or beautiful things in the world that remind us of the absolute transcendent good or beauty, which provide us with a path to psychic reintegration, to becoming one with ourselves and the cosmos. The problem is that we're not born knowing how best to react to the good or beautiful things we encounter in the world. We're born not knowing that we ought to recognize them only as triggers or signs of the absolute good, and instead we can, and usually do, take them for the true objects of our desire. And so most of us tend to spend most of our lives chasing limited, lesser goods. And so we can see how what Diotima says might be true. We could all desire nothing other than the good. But if this desire is essentially unconscious, then it isn't going to be manifesting itself in our actions as a desire for the good itself most of the time. And yet, we hear Plato and the long tradition of Platonists say, that need not be our fate, that forgetting of the absolute good. It is possible for us to open ourselves to these anti-traumatic triggers and to realize our true desire. In fact, this opening is, I think, really the essence of the care of the soul that Plato and the Platonists talk about so much. And as I said, I'll be getting into how we actually do this a little bit later in this series. But first I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the implications of this theoretical solution I've been talking about today. And that's what I'll be talking about next time, in 2 weeks. Anyway, I hope to see you then, and until then, be well, and thanks for watching.